So over the past year, I've been reflecting about what we've seen in Russia and kind of thinking about what the way ahead is going to look like. We watched the Russian playbook for what Putin presented to his people as a 3-day easy war where Russia would be welcomed with open arms in Ukraine, to now presenting it as an existential struggle for Russia. We saw this very same shift in playbook in the Cold War. And so Putin is using this in an ex post facto sort of way as he tries to mobilize the people and the industrial base of Russia to support what's going on in Ukraine. But it seems to be too little too late for them to be making any kind of strides in supplying the war effort and regenerating forces on the battlefield probably this year, which is why Putin is now seeking a more protracted long-term war, dragging it out as long as he can, so he can frame it as an existential crisis for the Russian people and get their buy-in. Not only buy-in financially, but buy-in on a time scale. Once Putin realized that this wasn't going to be an easy war to fight, it wasn't necessarily that he had changed the Russian tactics. We're still seeing the artillery barrage followed by infantry rush tactics of World War I, not so much the advanced combined arms fight that is necessary to win a war in the 21st century. But rather now, he's changing the rhetoric. He's changing the overarching strategy, and that is not a fight against Ukraine anymore. This is now a fight against NATO, and that Ukraine is an important keystone to the survival of Russia. And that means that Putin is authorized to dedicate Russian forces, Russian lives, and Russian treasure to fighting this as long as possible because it's a noble fight, quote unquote, for the existence of Russia. The problem is the Russian people are somewhat starting to see, and the rest of the world already sees, that on the one hand, Putin is saying this is an existential crisis for Russia, but on the other hand, he's actually not doing everything within his power to stop that existential crisis from playing out. It's obviously hypocritical. If there was a true threat to the complete destruction of the existence of Russia, they would be mobilizing millions of troops, forcing the military industrialization of its manufacturing base, and likely escalating its nuclear posture. None of that is happening, which means that is all rhetoric. And it is rhetoric to try to get people to continue to support this boondoggle in Ukraine for Russia, allowing Putin to buy time. Basically, the rhetoric of the Kremlin and his propagandists don't match what the actual scale of the war he is willing to fight is. If it was going to be the end of Russia, you would think that they would be mobilizing more than a couple 100,000 troops and kind of still only calling this a special military operation. And people are starting to wake up to that in Russia. Now, because he knows NATO is not really a threat to Russia, he wants the Ukrainian territory as a part of his legacy. He wants their resources. He wants access to the Black Sea, as well as a roadmap to Moldova and potentially other countries in Eastern Europe. Now, because people are waking up in Russia, I don't necessarily think Putin is under the threat of a coup, though. He continues to hold huge amounts of power and also continues to hold back the complete civilian capability of Russia because he doesn't want places like Moscow and St. Petersburg affected. He's presenting it in the media as a small skirmish that's going to plan, but it's against the larger NATO force, which, again, we on the West who have the critical thinking skills are seeing this as highly hypocritical. It doesn't make any sense. But within the Russian sphere, it seems to still make sense to the Russians. And by doing this, he is buying that time he so desperately needs to generate more forces, better trained conscript forces, to spin up his industry and develop a more cohesive command. And Putin is centralizing that command in order to make operational decisions better and more efficiently. But he still continues to have trust issues, and he continues to place loyal but very green officers that have zero combat experience, and there are zero non-commissioned officer support on the front lines because their non-commissioned officer corps is very weak in Russia. Putin made the mistake of allowing Wagner Group to become more powerful and experienced than the Russian units that were supporting them in the area, and Putin saw that, so Putin feels Wagner Group has gotten too powerful while simultaneously wearing out its usefulness on the front lines, which is why Wagner Group is not getting any more support. Putin realized his military is in no place to fight a large-scale multi-domain war right now. But he can't back out. If he backs out, he goes to prison. This is a big problem for him. He needs to convey power to the Russian people. And the Russian people will only continue to support Putin as long as he continues to lie to them about the victories going forward. But in the meantime, Russian reforms are needed in the military. The problem is any Russian reforms necessary to win battles against Ukraine are going to come far too late to affect Ukraine. I'm talking years worth of reforms, and that's if at all. Saying you're going to increase your military by 140,000 full-time soldiers, as Putin said he was going to, is one thing. But actually doing it and paying for it and training them and equipping them is a completely other thing. There are major costs. Even the units currently fighting are mere shells of what an effective fighting force would provide. In reality, they're just a paper force. That being said, Russia can regenerate forces. They can grow their military and mobilize their industry if they're given time to do so. And that is where the rest of the world comes in. I don't mean these forces are going to be able to affect any change in the current absolutely faltering Russian offensive, if it's even called that. And I don't even mean in the ability to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive that's likely going to take place in the spring. I'm talking about Russia buying enough time to continue this war into 2024 and beyond. At the very least, if the Ukrainians fail to drive Russia out of Ukraine by the end of this year, they will face a more entrenched Russian defense, if not a Russia that is capable of continuing offensive operations due to their force generation capability over this next year. This is why talks of stalemates are completely misguided, and people who say we are headed for a stalemate and also follow up with, so we might as well not give them any more weapons. Those types of people are leading us down a path where Russia will eventually be able to mobilize the military and industrial complex and the population to at least inflict more pain on Ukraine. Not necessarily completely take over the country, but it becomes more problematic and a longer, more drawn-out, protracted war. The next the next offensive that Ukraine fights is not going to win the war for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's going to take a series of offensives across multiple axes of the battlefield for Ukraine to take the territory Russia has grabbed in the past year. Russia is currently reeling from the blows that Ukraine and the West have dealt them, and if we slow down, they can recover. But if we continue to keep our foot on the gas, within the next year, we could be talking about a Ukraine retaking Crimea. That means an increase in support from Western nations. Ukraine needs to be able to plan their counteroffensives well in advance with the understanding that the supplies required to execute those advances are going to be there. Not just some piecemeal, random countries handing money and equipment over time. That is not sustainable because there's no way to plan around that. I fully support the goodwill of countries giving equipment to Ukraine, and I fully support everyone that is helping Ukraine, but we have to come together in the West if we really want Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, and we need to create a way to sustainably continue to feed ammunition, equipment, supplies, medical supplies, food, etc., to the front line in a reliable manner and not be reactive in logistics. We need to be more proactive in our sustainment. Therefore, the Ukrainians, with their brilliant level of planning, can effectively plan their offensives in sequence and thus drive Russia out. And then from there, build up Fortress Ukraine to make sure Russia can't do this ever again.